what I find fascinating is that, again, just to go back to ivermectin, just because that's the topic I've been digging into, is how research from different countries is perceived as being less than
Mm-hmm.
or better than because, like, well, this study was done in Nigeria, or this study was done in Brazil, or this study was done in Mexico, or whatever, and
Yep.
people won't come out and say it that they think it's fraudulent just because it was done, in a what did Trump call it? Yeah, that country. But like you kind of get the vibe, and they'll tell you in hushed tones in private that, like, well, if it's not really from, like, a top grade Western country, like, UK, US, that's basically it. But what we're willing to consider is like Anglosphere, really, maybe Australia, maybe
Yeah.
if they're really nice.
Well,
Um,
and then we come to find out that all the top-notch stuff is largely captured by very
here's
sophisticated
so so
players.
so here's what I found out, right, which really ties it all together. Fraud is everywhere, right? Just like,
Oh yeah.
dishonesty is everywhere, but there's not all is lost. What I found, what my sense is right now, is that I'd rather take a study from Pakistan that has been looked into with the standard methods of, like, fraud detection that we have,
Yeah.
because fraud that happens in, the non sort of core Western countries is pretty blatant. Like, you can just sort of tell.
Yeah.
Fraud that happens in the Western countries, dude, these people know what the fuck they're doing.
Yeah. Yeah. They are
They are sophisticated.
professional.
They're not fucking around. Like, seriously, kind of stuff. I mean, if people have read my stuff on Together, I'm like, they are taking every 0.1% advantage they can grab. They will take it, and they have like 150 of those, right? So they pack them all up, and then the study comes out looking a weird way, and you're like, what happened? Everything looks fine. They're
Yeah.
like, I found this, and they're like, yeah, but that's just 0.1%, right? It's tiny.
Yeah.
Like, that's probably not it. And then you're like, but I found this one. It's like, yeah, well, that's 0.2%. It's like, yeah, but if you add them all together, and there's like, dozens of them,
Yeah.
like, it's the
Yeah.
same thing, but it's much, much harder to prove that something went wrong.
It's like the gerrymandering process within science. Like,
Fantastic way to put it. I call it Potemkin arguments, right? Like Potemkin villages that the Soviet sort of had, that sort of, you these days, like, let's say you see a dignitary going to North Korea, right? And they
yeah.
show them like this beautiful village with, like, everybody's like orderly and everything is clean and whatever. And the story is that, like, when they leave, like, everything collapses or whatever, or it's like their
Yeah.
house aren't real, they're cardboard or whatever, right? It's kind of like that, where, if you look at it like twice, you're like, wow, this looks great.
Yeah.
And then you lift up a little rock and you're like, hey, wait,
Yeah.
this is plastic, right? And you look up, it's a Truman Show, right? There's a camera, like, it falls down and you're like, where did that come from?
Yes, 100%.
So,
So okay, go on.
no, it just gets so I'd much rather trust, I'm telling you, like a straight up, straightforward, very simple study done in Dhaka, Pakistan, or Dhaka, Bangladesh,
Yeah.
um, right? That was just done by somebody who just wanted to do a clean study, and did
Yeah.
a clean study, and it's very straightforward. You just look at it, and there's nothing to be confused about, right? And then you look at these,
Yeah.
like, complicated platform adaptive trials with, like, multiple arms running at the same time, and you're like, yes, like, these people are a lot more competent, but they're playing with machine guns, right? They're not.
Yeah.
There's just not water guns anymore.
Yeah, it's very very sophisticated. It also reminds me, I at some point when I was looking into like the lab leak stuff, there was like the chief science guy of China, you know, and he apparently, like, he's like Zai's like number one science dude. And somebody was brought to everybody's attention that he had committed fraud in a number of his papers. And the way in which he had committed fraud was simply taking like pictures and inverting them, and you like varying them by just changing their rotation, and
Right, right, right.
and making them the inverse, and like it was like, what, so such a he just knew that it didn't matter, and he just had to do a plausibly good enough job of making it look by somebody who is just scanning to not get caught,
Right.
that the fix is in, whatever, let's go.
Right. it's just like, yeah, that's like minimum viable fraud or whatever, right?
Minimum
And you see a
viable
lot of that.
fraud, yes.
You see a lot of that. That's the thing. Like if you see a bad study
Yeah.
abroad, I just feel like it's just like pretty obvious that it was a horrible study.
So I was, in my professional world, this is years ago. I was, judging some SQL queries that were being written as a test for some of our partners over in India, and they just, some people suspected fraud, and they brought me in to like just, say like, did I suspect it? And like, it was so blatantly obvious that they had just copied each other. They kept even like the same indenting, the same, like there was like one parameter that they would change, like variable names, but like all the other stuff would be like exactly the same. I'm like, how, this is not possible. Like you didn't write these things yourselves. So, but it's like, what I can't understand is that for some segments of the population in India, it's like like passing was more important than anything. Like you didn't, it didn't really matter if you were copying off of somebody, but you need to give the appearance of competency. Otherwise, it's a huge risk for you and your family, and you don't, pass through school and this or that. So there was a little re-education that went on expectations that had to go on. But this is kind of how they grew up.
Here's the thing. So I had a very, very similar thing in the UK when I was a teaching assistant, right?
Yeah.
So I was sort of evaluating homework for students, right? And people don't realize this when they're turning in their homework, but when you're looking at a group of people and you're like, all the Cypriots had the same variations of the same assignment, right?
Yeah.
And all, like, not, I don't know if all, but like 95% of the
enough,
each national cluster, like it
yeah,
was identical or
yeah,
close, or like they changed the colors or whatever, the background.
yeah.
You're like, dude, this is so blatant, like whatever. And you could even tell kind of who did it because they probably did a little bit more on theirs, and the other ones like weren't confident when they were demoing it or whatever. Like it was blatant, right? Here's the thing, though, they did what they did. The university was like, I was like, my professor, like, what are you going to do about this? And he's like, well, I can't like fail 80% of my class,
Yeah.
right? So
Yep.
they passed. So who's the fraudster here, right?
Oh no, it's a fraud up and down the chain. And this is like, I mean, I don't want to like get on my high horse about the United States, because I think we have unbelievable problems in the academic system these days, especially outside the hard sciences, where it's like none of a huge swath of the humanities, the James Lindsay, for example, submitting these papers, to these journals that are just completely and utterly made up, that get in there and like highlighted and whatnot. So it's like, it is becoming ubiquitous that
But that's the thing. It's not just the hard sciences. That's the thing. I mean, what I've seen in medical sciences is just, yeah, so many things. I think about it sometimes like the internet, right? The early internet was built on trust, right? You could send an email to anybody and pretend to be anybody, and they would receive it, right? And it would say like, Bill G at Microsoft.com sent you this thing, right? Because they hadn't thought that like, it's, and they've had to remake basically all the protocols, HTTP became HTTPS and whatever, like just to encrypt like all the things, so that like it's like the barest security. Well, when it comes to science, we're still back in the day where we built everything to run on the honor code or whatever.
Yeah.
And it's, it's just become this raw power game now, because everybody knows that the rules are not solid enough. So everybody knows it's judgment that has to be applied. So it's actually the worst of all worlds, right? Because the FDA makes things hard enough so that only big pharma can really get through the process.
Yep.
But it is also like broken enough that they can get anything they want through the process. So it is just, I can't go and get a drug approved, right? Because it just needs so many hoop jumping, but the hoops are pointless, right? Like it's just, they're just hoops. So if you know what to do, you can get, almost anything through. And, that's just how it is. It's just how, like it's really the worst of all worlds in some parts of the health space. And I guess this is what really has gotten me to pay so much attention to this, because it's just dire. Like you don't really know what to trust at this point. And it's not like, okay, you bought a toy that like didn't last as long. Like these are drugs that are killing people.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, I have become I used to be, I remember conversations not 7 8 years ago that I had where, you know, I would do my little condescending thing where I would say to people, you know, who believed in I
Did not
can't
have
even think of a good
100%
example. You
compliance with the science.
Yeah, I was just like, you know, if it worked, they'd call it science. And I was, you know, I'd say shit like that. And now I'm like, oh God, that's so cringe.